to cover chapter 15, which is Darwin and his evolutionary theory, and some of the history behind that. Just a brief outline here. This first video, we're going to look at the history of evolutionary thought, some of the scientists and people before Darwin that sort of contributed to his thinking, to his ideas. The next video, we'll look at the meat and potatoes of his theory, what his theory was, and how he explained evolutionary change in organisms. And then the third video, final video, will be on what evidence do we have for evolution. So without further ado, here is 15.1, the history of evolutionary thought. And in this first video, we want to take a look at people that sort of influenced Darwin's ideas of biology, or his theory of evolution in biology. Before that, though, why do we study biology? Your book refers to evolution as the guts of biology. In other words, the great unifying theory of biology. So if you look at the arch over here, where you have all these different areas of different topics in biology, you have on the origin of species, the book he wrote here, kind of that tying, holding. If you pull this book out, the rest will sort of collapse in. In other words, this idea of evolution explains the unity and the diversity that we find in the biological fields of life. So when we look at all the amazing critters out there, it explains unity, recent common ancestors versus things that are very different, that had very ancient, long time ago ancestors, and how those things are all sort of related, but similar processes that we find in each. First, before we get into the people, prior to Darwin, the view of nature is determined by deep-seated beliefs. So most of the time we're talking the literal creation story that we find in Genesis, where it's 6 days, and the specific creation that it talks about there. Although that's often sort of the idea pushed by the church and most people of that time, there were various ideas of evolution sort of starting to form. We'll talk about the scala natura, where a lot of people just thought, hey, there's this scale of creatures from like the most sponges, the most non-complex, all the way up to humans. And eventually, like if you look at the Linnaean thing here, it's up to, the angels, and then eventually God kind of at the top is the most complex. But the idea was there were some ideas of evolution, of things changing, not necessarily being fixed on a rung, that biologists were beginning to mention, talk about sort of in the 15, 16, 1700s. One of those first people was Carolus Linnaeus. You'll see pictures of all these people. A lot of them have the wigs, the nice flowing locks from the 1700s. Linnaeus did a lot of work in taxonomy. In other words, trying to classify organisms and put them into different categories. And he talked about the scala natura, or ladder of life, that I kind of had on the last slide as well. This is some of the descriptions from Linnaeus here, where there's a fixity of species, and there's sort of like the lower plants, inanimates, all the way. And notice who's at the top. Okay, we have man at the top. And then he sort of makes this list from mammals down to reptiles and fish, crustaceans, insects, mollusks, sort of what he thought was the most complex to the least complex. He also did the binomial nomenclature, which we've talked about before. In Bio 1, for example, humans are Homo sapiens, whereas, the Homo is the genus name, the sapiens is the species name. And so every living creature, every different kind of creature gets a very specific by-to-name naming system that you are familiar with. The next person is Jorge Louis LeClaire, or we just call Count Buffoon, which seems kind of silly to me that, we don't call people buffoons or buffons. now is not an endearing term, but he was Count Buffon. Okay, his picture up here. Very stately gentleman. He was a naturalist, studied nature, and he tried to make a catalog of all the living creatures on the earth that we knew about and catalog them, classify them. It was this big push in the 1700s to put everything, like in a grocery store, everything in certain categories. And he, when it comes to evolution, he suggested evidence of descent with modification. So things like environmental influences, migration patterns, geographical isolation, the struggle for existence, things that we'll talk about in Darwin's theory. He kind of mentions in his volumes and his how he sort of grouped different organisms together. Another person your book mentions is Erasmus Darwin. This gentleman over here was actually Charles Darwin's grandpa. He was a doctor, but also a naturalist. Loved spending time outside. We think maybe Darwin, enjoyed going out with him, helping him collect. Back then, naturalists collected a lot of specimens and tried to classify them. He did a lot of writings in botany, which is the study of plants, zoology, insects, animals. And again, he made comments and footnotes suggesting the possibility of evolution. Things like selective breeding, how humans have bred certain traits and gotten things to change, vestigial structures, those things like an appendix that no longer have a use or function. So again, influences to Darwin. His grandpa, who he probably spent a bunch of time with on the English countryside, out in nature, helping him with his collections. Grandpa probably talked about this, probably influenced Darwin in his thinking. On the late 18th, early 19th century, we get into some other people that would influence Darwin. Baron Jorge Cuvier. Cuvier was a zoologist who sort of studied living stuff, but also was looking at layers of rock and fossils. And so when he was looking in the Paris Basin, and this is one of his drawings here, when he looked at fossils, he noticed that sometimes you'd have a lot of the same fossils, and then in a layer there would be a sudden change. He resisted the idea of evolution, of an old Earth. He was an advocate of the fixity of species, special creation. So how did he explain, if species are fixed, how did he explain these sudden changes? He used this idea of catastrophism to explain changes, which would say things like the global flood, Noah's flood. Those kind of things caused upheaval, quick, fast changes, and that changes the living things that were on the earth. Also, around that time period, JeanBaptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck is famous for his first sort of evolutionary theory. And you may remember him from Bio 1. He's the thing with the giraffe neck thing. He did the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So characteristics you acquire in your lifetime, or an organism would acquire in their lifetime, they would pass on to their offspring. So you have this short-necked giraffe. They're reaching up for the trees to get the leaves. And over time, as they keep stretching their necks and stretching, eventually you get a giraffe with a really long neck. So things stay the same except for characteristics that they acquire during the lifetime. Now, we now know genetically this not to be true. This might seem silly to us now with knowing how traits are passed and acquired and mutations. But it's important because he sort of threw out that first idea or theory of evolution so that the thinking was beginning to change. People were daring enough to sort of offer ideas on how species change over time, even though it was incorrect. Also influential to Darwin were these two geologists. James Hutton, this is James Hutton over here, was a geologist, proposed kind of this theory of slow, uniform geological change. So kind of opposite of catastrophism, where there was this very rapid global change and laying down of rock layers. He said he looked at things like earthquakes, erosion, those type of things. He said it's very slow, and he said it's uniform. and he sort of talked about those ideas. Charles Lyle, who was the foremost geologist during Darwin's time, wrote a book, Principles of Geology, this thing down here, in 1830, that sort of published it, put Hutton's ideas out there, and made this idea of uniformitarianism. So uniform. The slow processes that are happening today have always been happening that way back through the Earth's history. And they say Darwin actually took this book with him on his voyage on the Beagle, and he, influenced his idea and gave him the idea that the Earth must be very, very old. So instead of 10,000 years old, the Earth, first the Grand Canyons and some of these things to be mountain ranges, the Earth had to be maybe millions of years old. And for Darwin's process to occur, he needed time for that slow change to occur. Lyle and Hutton very much influenced him in that. And finally was Thomas Malthus. He was an economist studying population growth, especially when you talk about human population growth. With human population growth, he said, look, as the human population is sort of doing this exponential growth kind of thing that we talk about, there's also this idea of there's a steady thing of resources. Okay. And he said there's a crossing point here where those two things are crossed, and there's going to be a point of crisis where there's not enough food, shelter, and so forth to support that growing population. And that's going to lead to war, famine, epidemics. In other words, the struggle for existence. And that became important with Darwin when he just looked at creatures, living things in the natural world, and as they're competing against each other in the natural environment for resources, habitat, food, prey, not to be eaten, the struggle of existence was important in Darwin's theory. Okay, so that sort of wraps up this first section. The next section will take a look at Darwin and his voyage and his actual theory.